All right, so finally we got this to work. Thanks for your patience, and also again, welcome and thanks for showing up at this early hour. I'm glad to see some of you already attended the doctor colloquium, had an intense 3 days behind them and another intense 3 days ahead of them, I guess, like all of us. So thanks for coming. So this PhD forum, as Philip already mentioned, is about trying to get a little bit of exposure to all of you doctoral students to some of the topics that we feel are important in accounting research and are topics that everybody should be aware of, not necessarily working on actively, but should be aware of and thinking about. And every year we kind of try and bounce around ideas, what could be a good topic to address in this plenary session of the PhD forum that would create the most benefit for all of you. And this year, we decided on digitalization, digital transformation, and what it means for accounting and accounting research. And I realize probably you might be among those people who have had enough of these buzzwords, and I'm gonna try to use as few as I can. When I started noticing these trends a couple of years back, it felt like a little bit like sex and teenagers, right? So everybody was kind of interested and excited about these trends, but most of them knew very little about them, but everybody kind of assumed everybody else already knew a lot. And just like sex and teenagers, right? And nowadays, I guess these trends, digital transformation, big data, data analytics have become difficult to ignore. And we want to acknowledge that and want to dedicate a session to these topics and try to discuss what do these massive changes that are already happening, what do those mean for accounting and also for accounting research, and what can we as an academic profession do to understand better what are these forces that are shaping increasingly the business world and the economic world, and how do they affect accounting in particular. So I want to set the stage by giving just a little bit of a framework. I'm not pretending to be inclusive or comprehensive here, and I'm gonna relegate soon to two of the expert speakers that we have here, Al Bimani from LSE and Glenn Gray, who are both going to talk about these topics and know much more about them than I probably ever will. Just to set the stage a little bit, from a personal standpoint, I personally noticed two very interesting books that I am currently reading, or I'm through one of them and reading the other one. If you have time between all the things that you're doing otherwise in your lives, might be interesting to check them out. The one is called Machine Platform Crowd, and it's written by two of the eminent scholars, two economists in this field, who discuss what these megatrends mean for businesses and for the economy. With machines, they basically mean artificial intelligence or other algorithmic machines that increasingly are used to support and even make decisions in business contexts. By platforms, they mean the transition from companies offering products and rendering services to basically creating platforms that people can interact on. You all know what I mean when I talk about Uber or Airbnb or even Google or Apple, all of these platform-based businesses. And then the third phenomenon is crowds, where decisions are or interactions are increasingly not only based on several people at the core of an organization, managers or experts, but are increasingly made and prepared using crowd wisdom and people contributing their time and their knowledge to a lot of different sorts of questions. The other book, Prediction Machines, is very interesting. It focuses on one of these areas, and that is AI, artificial intelligence. And it kind of asks, let's assume we can simplify and understand AI algorithms and similar sorts of software developments. We can simplify and just understand them as prediction machines. That is, machines that help us to make predictions much more quickly, in many cases more accurately, and also much more cheaply than humans can. what is this going to imply for businesses, for economies, and what is it also going to imply, I want to challenge you to think about for accounting. So if you're interested in this, this might be two interesting books to read over the summer maybe, while you're on these planes to all these flyouts, for example. Right? As a little bit of a framework, this is at least how I think about these topics at the moment. I want to start with this picture that has become dear to my heart because I use it in every single class that I teach as a first slide, basically. This is a framework that, Glenn, you might appreciate. This has been developed by the AAA a few years back when the AAA started becoming very worried that accounting was an academic field that generated less and less interest with young students. And they tried to find a way to reinvigorate the interest in accounting, and they tried to find a way to explain to people that accounting is much more than a technical activity that should be done by experts sitting somewhere in windowless basements crunching numbers. And they came up with this notion that really at the bottom of everything is economic activity, business activities, businesses trying to create value, engaging in all different sorts of product, innovative activities, product decisions, services, all of these different economic activities going on at the firm level. And accounting was about transforming these economic activities into meaningful information that is useful to a whole range of stakeholders. I mean, you know all about this decision usefulness idea. And in between there, translating economic activity into meaningful information was this area of judgment and human professional judgment and discretion. How can we exercise judgment to translate these economic activities into meaningful information? And to me, it seems like digital transformation really affects two aspects of this whole pyramid, and is therefore very important for us to think about. The first way in which digital transformation comes into the picture, I think, is at the very bottom. It affects the business activities that we talk about, right? What about a company holding Bitcoin? How are they going to account for that? What is Bitcoin under IFRS, for example? Is that a financial asset? Is it inventory? Is it an intangible? It's not very clear, and it's something we need to think about. Or, for example, if a company like Volkswagen or Fiat, if they're going to transition from selling cars to providing mobility services, how is that going to change the kind of KPIs that they should be using in their management accounting? How is this going to change the data that auditors are going to look at to figure out if the financial statements are true and fair, right? So these kinds of transformations of the business models of companies, that's the first thing that creates challenges and interesting questions for accounting. But then also a little bit higher up in this hierarchy, we also have to think about how accounting processes and systems change as we digitalize our internal finance departments, right? If we're going to automate certain processes or standardize, what about shared service centers? What about prediction machines being used in making accounting-related forecasts and in making accounting-related judgments? How is that going to affect the nature of the information that comes out and its usefulness potentially to stakeholders? I think those are two ways in which digital transformation comes into the picture, and you can only imagine the richness of the questions that arise from this. And I'm sure there's a lot of stuff to look at, a lot of moving parts, and all of us probably will find our niche in this field and can potentially work on some of these aspects in order to help ultimately render accounting decision useful to all these stakeholder groups out there in practice. And having said that, I want to kind of outline at least what I perceive could be a research agenda in this field. If you're going to view digital transformation as a phenomenon of interest, typically what we do in a lot of at least empirical work, we're interested in the effects of this phenomenon, right? What does digital transformation do to a number of outcomes we're interested in? And I already said digital transformation does involve digital transformation of business activities and also digital transformation of processes. So one thing we could be interested in how does digital transformation of business activities map into certain outcomes? How does it affect recognition decisions, measurement issues, disclosure, but also taxation and auditing? How are all those activities in accounting going to be affected? On the side of the processes, which Glenn will be talking about, how are process automations, how is artificial intelligence in the finance organizations, how is that going to affect a whole range of outcomes, including accounting quality, for example, timeliness of reporting, what about capital market outcomes, information asymmetries, how is it going to affect the information environment, what about audit and tax outcomes? I think those are all interesting questions, and above all of those, of course, lingers this notion that all of these digital transformation processes, they're all endogenous, right? So it's not something that companies randomly get exposed to. It's something that companies consciously decide to do to transform themselves and become digitalized. So these determinants are also very important to understand. My last slide, I want to challenge you to think about also not only what digital transformation means for accounting itself, but also what it means for accounting research more specifically. And just a few almost random selected thoughts from what has occurred to me that's going to change as we digitalize further. I mean, there will be new phenomena of interest that we could look at. For example, what about crowdsourced phenomena like crowdsourced forecasts? You might know about this platform that sources earnings forecasts from a bunch of laymen out there who want to make their forecasts about a company's earnings known, and that can be aggregated, and it shows up that these aggregated crowd forecasts, they tend to be better than analysts' expert forecasts in many ways. Then there will be new theories or changes to existing theories that come out of this. For example, if you think about decision theory, where we try to understand how people make decisions under uncertainty, a big problem with decision making under uncertainty is, of course, that predictions tend to be expensive and they tend to be wrong oftentimes. What happens if we invent algorithms that allow us to make a certain type of predictions better, more accurate, and a lot cheaper than human predictions? What is that going to do for decision making and for how companies operate? And then I could go on endlessly about different sources of data that are becoming available by the minute. Data that no accountant 5 years ago would have dreamed of ever being able to use. Collecting this data, analyzing this data. We might wake up to the fact at some point that maybe regression analysis is not the best way to understand the world. We should probably look into exploratory data analysis, much more visualization of data, rich data where there's patterns that could be suggestive of causal mechanisms, but might just be spurious correlations. And also, in the end, digitalization, of course, means that we can have much more and much richer ways of sharing and disseminating our research once we have prepared it, or even collaborate while we're still preparing it in a much more real time, in a much richer way. So I think there's a lot of implications to all of this that we can barely scratch the surface today. And I'm very happy that we have been able to convince two of the leading experts in the field to be with us here today. The first is Al Bimani of LSE. Al is a professor of management accounting, and one of his research interests is the effect of digital transformation on management accounting, and that's what you're here to talk about. Next to him is Glenn Gray, a professor emeritus of information systems from California, and Glenn will talk about implications for audit research. And again, both of you know more about this topic or have forgotten more about this topic than I probably will ever know. I'm looking much forward to your remarks. Al, if you would like to go first, floor is yours. Thanks for coming. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. It didn't actually take that much convincing to come to Milan. I've been here many times, and every time I come, I know how good the food is and how good the shopping is. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm not sure I'll attend that many accounting papers. You can't do that if you come to Milan, I don't think. So, as was mentioned, what I'd like to talk about is this idea of digital transformation. Sometimes an overused word, but a very real thing, I think, in terms of what's taking shape within organizations. So in terms of the structure of my talk, I'll talk a bit about data trends and what's happening there. Um, One of the key things that I'll identify that's happened in the past 20 years in terms of internet-based companies is size. Size has been absolutely key, and it's transformed organizational objectives. With that transformation, accounting objectives have had to kind of massage themselves around this new objective. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk about what's new today as opposed to 5 or 10 years ago in terms of the digital economy. And then I'll say a few words about management accounting changes and the implications for research. And this will be sort of a very small subset of what can be done, which I think offers huge opportunities. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. Is this better? Yeah. Okay. I'm not going to repeat everything I just said. I just said Milan was great, and it's a pleasure to be here. Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. So the, you know, when I went to New York, I was told, "Oh, this is a great city because it's a city that never sleeps." And the truth is that data never sleeps. And so my first message to you is that you shouldn't sleep either, because you're management accounting researchers, or perhaps broadly sort of defined accounting researchers, and accounting is really about data. Even if you're doing something that is highly analytical or narrative, you still have to sort of look at data at some stage. And there is a true explosion of data globally. I gave a talk about 4 years ago where I talked about digital transformations in organizations, and I kind of had a few statistics about the amount of data that sort of exists in the world. That was really quite astounding. But today I can give kind of an even more astounding sort of reflection on the amount of data that we have, that we generate, and so on. In 3-4 years from now, I'll probably sort of say exactly the same thing. So, you know, if you think of data, about 90% of data that is existing today didn't exist about 2 years ago. That wasn't something I could have said 3 or 4 years ago. And perhaps I'll be saying the same message in terms of every 6 months we have that sort of data growth. But the interesting thing, I think, about data, and you can get all sorts of statistics, say, you know, the number of searches on Google. There's about sort of 4.2 billion internet users on the planet, but there are sort of more than 5 billion searches a day. About 3/4 are taking place on Google. If you look at sort of Twitter, if you look at Tinder, if you're on Tinder, you find that the number of swipes is absolutely incredible. And that shows sort of the extent to which people want to connect with one another. Tinder has a nice advertiser about the number of swipes that results in a number of relationships. And that becomes a kind of accounting indicator for them. So you have all sorts of possibilities when it comes to using data to translate that into sort of accounting implications. Now, in the next 3, 4, 5 years, the data growth comes from a new sort of technology. And this is the Internet of Things. So everything becomes connected to everything else, machines to machines and machines to humans and vice versa. The growth of Internet of Things is basically sort of sensors that connect machines and sensors that collect information that sort of humans do something about. That is set to grow exponentially. So, you know, there's lots of suggestions and lots of data on that. But, you know, the suggestion here is that before long, we'll see about 1 trillion IoT devices. Those are devices that, in a sense, become part of a product but they also become the information systems within the product. So as accountants, we've kind of looked at things that happen in the sort of physical realm, and then we collect, as was suggested in terms of the AAA pyramid, we collect economic data that reflects things that are happening. Now we're actually going into the products themselves, and as things happen to product, we have information systems within the products that collect data. So the product becomes the information processor, in a sense, through IoT devices. I think that's going to transform certainly the amount of information that we'll be able to access, but also the very nature of accounting. Now, if we think traditionally, if you open a business, then you kind of have a very small business, and then you kind of see that it's beginning to be successful. And as accountants, we kind of know that, you have to have a budget, and you look at cash coming in, cash going out, and sometimes the cash coming in isn't sort of fast enough in relation to the cash going out, and yet your business is growing. So you go to a bank or a financial institution, and you say, this is a great business, but I need money, and they'll kind of do their analysis, and they'll say, you're absolutely right, you need money, we want to back your organization. But about 20 years ago, something sort of quite interesting happened. And this was the notion that profits don't matter as much as size, as much as volume growth. And volume growth became the indicator through which sort of financing started to take place. So a lot of companies then began to focus on basically getting big fast. You get big fast, which means that you have greater volume, you leave profits aside, as Amazon did for about 17 years, and yet it grew and grew and grew, and it has one of the highest market sort of caps in the world. In fact, yesterday on the FT, if you looked at it, it was suggesting that Apple its market cap is about 925 billion. It'll potentially be the first sort of trillion-dollar company, but it could be Amazon, or it could be Alphabet, or it could be Microsoft. So these companies that you're all familiar with are the ones that are in effect sort of growing in size. And the interesting thing to look at is how the accounting sort of mechanics ensure that growth becomes the primary element, especially in a digital economy. So you can sort of look at the basic income statement equation in terms of sort of variable and fixed costs. So your profits are your selling price less variable costs. You take away your fixed costs and you're left with profit. If you look at that equation in terms of a pure internet play, you'll find that, first of all, your variable costs are almost zero. They're almost non-existent. A click doesn't cost a dime. A click doesn't cost anything. There may be some variable costs underlying the organization, but they're going to be pretty low if you're an entirely digital sort of operation. So variable costs become very low, and they almost cease to matter in terms of their accuracy. If you then look at fixed costs, most of the fixed costs tend to be sunk. In other words, you kind of invest a huge amount in coding, in cyber marketing, in security. You basically invest in servers, which are going to be out of date sort of quite soon. You have a huge amount of fixed costs, and most of those are sunk. But those are very, very high fixed costs. You then look at pricing, and you say, if volume is what matters, then you can afford to decrease price. Now, in an industrial economy, you would say, okay, I'm going to decrease my price to be more competitive until I hit my variable cost. But if you think of your variable cost as being zero, then you can pretty much sort of give away your product free of charge. Yeah? So why would you do that if you've got a lot of fixed costs to cover? During the sort of late 90s, there was a realization that, in fact, venture capitalists want to give you a lot of money for you to put into fixed costs. If you're going to grow, then ultimately the market cap of the organization is going to grow. So the name of the game was volume growth to basically power market capitalization. And I'm going to suggest that that's really worked beautifully in the past 20 years. We've got bigger and bigger and bigger companies, the four that I've just mentioned, and a few others. But you're all familiar with a lot of this kind of social networking platforms. You look at sort of Facebook, it's got sort of about more than a quarter of the world's population. You look at other internet sites and you find that it is mind-boggling what the sort of user base happens to be. So these companies have become bigger and bigger and bigger, powered through the idea that volume matters more than profits, at least for a while. Okay, but we want to explore that a little bit further. You look at some of these companies in terms of sort of global populations across countries, and you find that certainly Facebook is kind of bigger than China or India. Large tech companies are getting bigger and bigger. So what were the strategies that were put into place to enable these organizations to become bigger? First of all, I mentioned that you can decrease the selling price down to zero in order to attract sort of users on your website. You can actually, if you think about it, if you have very, very deep pockets, you can actually have negative selling prices. You can not only give away the product, but you can actually pay people to take the product away if they're going to be using it. And that's what's happened with a number of companies. PayPal is a key kind of case in point. So one strategy has been to decrease selling prices. And of course, that means that you become a monopoly. The second or third or fourth entrant, which is not as technologically adept as you are, is not going to stand a chance. So the bigger the company and the faster it grows, the bigger it's going to get because you exclude competition. The other point is that you basically have sort of certain ways of locking in customers. You have all sorts of websites that kind of get you to do certain things, and you find that you're so used to doing those things in a certain way that you don't move to the competition. Hotmail started that in a very big way. You have your Hotmail sort of address or email address on your business card. It's very difficult then to switch to something else and sort of give the 10,000 people sort of a new business card. So these are some of the strategies that have been used. Network effects is probably the biggest one that's been used. And this is the idea that an organization, say, like AOL, 20 years ago exactly, discovered the power of networks. And this was based on the notion that if you have a user and the user base grows, the incumbent user actually gets more value out of that growth. So if you have a volume increase, you're going to sort of sponsor more volume increase through network effects. So you have sort of three kind of big explanations as to why some firms have managed to become so big so very quickly. The argument is that there's a new kind of game in town, which is, as was very nicely sort of mentioned, predictive machines or artificial intelligence. This, I suspect, is going to power organization volume growth more than anything else that we've ever seen. China sort of thinks that its GNP within sort of 10 years will be powered to the tune of about 24% through artificial intelligence. So in the US, it's about 18%. In the UK, it's about 10%. Different countries, as you probably know, have different sort of ways in which they think information is sensitive. If you look at China, information, yeah, it's okay. If you can access it, there aren't too many regulations surrounding that. The US, a bit less. The UK, much more. And with GDPR, so you're going to find that you're going to have certain constraints on the extent to which organizations can grow through artificial intelligence. But what does it actually do? So if you look at what accounting bodies, let alone IS individuals, suggest, first of all, it's about dealing with very large data sets. And it is about sort of coding the idea that a machine can learn on its own account, and that learning makes it more powerful to learn even more and even faster. So the generation of data allows machines to learn, and it teaches machines to decide what other sources of data could become useful into the parameters of information analysis. So large data sets means growing data sets from that point of view. As was sort of pointed out quite correctly, data is becoming cheaper, but the analysis of data is becoming even cheaper. Ultimately, one might suggest that it's about the generation of insights. So it is about sort of looking at reams and reams of data and saying, wow, I've found correlations. Now, as accounting researchers, I think you've always been told that, yeah, it's fine to find a correlation, but you need to be able to explain it. What is the underlying sort of philosophy that sort of gets two sets of data to correlate? And you've always kind of been told to worry about that in accounting research. My sense is that businesses are going to worry less and less and less about the explanation as to what underpins correlations. If there is a correlation and it leads to economic value growth, then that's what the business decision is going to be. So that is quite an interesting thing to look at. As accountants, you're used to asking why. I think machines may not want to ask why. They'll simply ask how and what is the sort of decision outcome from that. Of course, then, you might suggest that if you're less worried about the intensity of data analysis and more about the insight that they provide, then it frees up your time to do more decision-making things. So what are the big sort of tech platforms doing? And these were kind of newspaper headlines that I collected only in the past 3 months. Every single internet pure play, social platform, and others are using artificial intelligence. And it really is about sort of collecting data that allows these organizations to basically make better decisions in terms of powering further growth. So I suspect that AI will really increase sort of volume within organizations. So what does that mean in terms of management accounting research? First of all, you might suggest that traditionally you would have had so you would have had perhaps a product which didn't sell in very high volume, it didn't sort of generate much profit, and you'd say, okay, we need to get this product profitable, so you need to basically get it over this line. Once you've done that, then you're focusing on volume and you end up with winning products. Today, you might suggest that volume is everything, even if you're making a loss. Because what it is that you're selling is not, in fact, what the user thinks is being sold. It's what the purchaser is buying. And so, you know, there's the old saying, you know, if you're not buying something, then you're not you're the product. And this is exactly what's happened. And this is why sort of we have this whole thing with Facebook being sort of accused of doing all sorts of messy things with people's data. The point is that data has become so important that it doesn't matter if you lose money on what generates data, as long as the outcomes ultimately yield profits. Now, what this means is that if you think of your income statements sort of format, you have your revenues and you have your costs. For the first time in history, you have a total dissociation between the revenue line and the cost line. The cost line relates to users, the revenue line relates to purchases of the eyes of the users. And that is a very different sort of decision-making setup for organizations to have to contend with. The other thing that I might suggest is that you've probably seen sort of a diagram such as this, where you have this sort of long sort of long tail, and then you've got kind of a fat head here. This kind of was representing organizations that people thought would kind of lose their branding to a degree, because the internet allows more sort of sellers to come on board. It was kind of incorrect as an assumption, but the graph is beautiful because I think it depicts exactly what we're seeing now. You have very few pure play on the internet sort of platforms, and you have a huge number of small companies that service some of what's happening here. You just have to look at your Apple iPhone, and then you'll see sort of thousands of apps or millions of apps that you can purchase. This is the long tail versus the one sort of big fat Apple, which is soon going to have a market cap of $1 trillion. So this is exactly what's happening today. Big companies and a multitude of small companies, and that has implications, I think, for accounting information. If we think of Porter, then, you know, traditionally we've been told, okay, Porter would suggest either you have a product that you differentiate and you can sort of set premium prices, or you have sort of, you know, the sort of low-cost items where you're value-driven. The contention increasingly is that all organizations need to move in this segment here. And you can because of the internet, you can because of digitization, you can because not just of digitization, but digitalization. So the idea that you can power organizations to make better decisions through digitization. The best diagram here, of course, comes from this great book, which I encourage you to purchase. And the suggestion here is that traditionally we think of the planning and control frame of reference around which much of management accounting is predicated. But now we basically have micro-level impact, which gives us information, which then allows us to continuously revise our strategies. So the point is that operational information is allowing us to change our strategy on a day-to-day basis, and so it redefines the very notion of strategy. If we look at all sorts of other work that's going on at the interface between IS and management accounting, certainly cybersecurity is a massive issue, and as the agency theory sort of tells us quite a lot about how much you should be investing, for instance, in cyber-secure networks. Contingency relationships have been part of sort of the accounting research environment for about 40 odd years. My sense is that traditionally we used to say that strategy determines structure, which determines accounting sort of form. Today, I would suggest that that's been completely upended. It is sort of upside down because of digitization, and that allows us to kind of infer all sorts of research sort of questions. Compensation issues, I kind of mentioned earlier, but a huge potential for research here. Transaction costs and the idea that either we had markets of hierarchies. I think today we have that swelling middle, which is almost sort of everything that the internet sort of comprises. So real interesting sort of research that can be done there. Sociological sort of theorizing, there's a huge amount of work that's being done there. How is digitization changing the way in which we use information, the way in which organizational cultures are taking shape, the way in which sort of digital natives are so different from digital immigrants. And so there's quite a lot of research sort of being done in that area. The last point that I want to mention is one that's on everyone's mind. When you talk about digitalization, you kind of talk about, is there a future for accounting work? If you think, for instance, of AI sort of being tied to decision-making, deeper insights, sort of faster analysis that are perhaps sort of much deeper, and then you say, but that's what the management accountant was doing, so what does the management accountant do? There are suggestions that, almost all of our activities are set to alter drastically in the next sort of about 20-odd years, the suggestion is. So I think we're in for very, very massive changes. Different people deal in different ways to cope with this. Maybe I'll sort of let you have this. But you can see that the Italians cope with problems by eating good pasta. Other people sort of do it differently. But essentially, I think digitization has thrown up all sorts of issues, some of which we perceive as accountants to be problematic because they're going to erase a lot of the value added that we've given organizations. So as a last slide then, accountancy bodies are kind of sort of very, very worried. And their suggestion is that we have no choice but to interact with machines in a sort of intelligent way. And if that's true, then certainly management accounting researchers need to do exactly the same thing, become more adept in terms of the interface between man and machine and organizations. Okay, so I'll leave it there, and yeah, I think we'll take questions.
Thanks a lot, Al. Without any further ado, I want to hand over to Glenn to continue the discussion. Probably going to need help again here.
Why he's doing this? I have to tell you a technology story that you will all be telling your friends. Now, maybe you've seen this story, but a couple of weeks ago, oh, thank you. An 18-year-old woman wow. All right. So an 18-year-old woman was sitting at a meeting, and her Apple Watch said to her, seek medical advice immediately. Now, nobody even knew an Apple Watch had that message built into it. But her watch said, seek immediate medical advice. So she's like, oh, I don't know what to do. She called her mother. Her mother said, well, go to the clinic, see what they say. And the clinic ran some tests, and they go, you need to go to the emergency room right now. So she went to the emergency room, and they diagnosed that her kidneys were failing. And she would have been dead if her Apple Watch hadn't told her to seek medical advice. I mean, think about that. So if you don't own an Apple Watch, you need to think about this. Now, I do have to give you one. Now, by the way, that is a true story. Because now once I give you the disclaimer, you might think, oh, he just made up that story. So the disclaimer is I own Apple stock. So just to let you know. Okay. But it is a true story. All right. So moving on. Now, I have 28 slides in 20 minutes. So you guys do the math. Originally, I had 40 slides. But so the slides will be available. So what I want to do is just kind of buzz through the slides and kind of hit the high points. So then, you know, at your leisure, you can go back, and if there was something of particular interest, you can always study it a little further. All right. So we were asked to talk about the digitization of accounting, and, you know, what's the definition of that? Well, one beautiful, clean definition is the paperless office. So just think about that, right? There's a longer one, which basically says we're changing from paper to computers. That's fine. But then you look at the last thing, but what about auditors? So I was asked to talk about this topic a little bit from the AIS and the audit side. So you can see what KPMG said. As digital innovations is speeding ahead, the audit profession is forced to follow. It's not a question of whether we need to change, but when and how fast, right? So all this stuff is moving along very rapidly, and we're definitely in need of research. All right, so I'm just repeating the same statistic you saw before, right? So this study, which, by the way, we're PhD students. I don't know how they did this study. You know, let's be honest here. But anyways, because look what their goal was. If I can figure out how to use the pointer. That didn't do it. Whoops, that didn't do it for sure. Oh my God, what do they do now? Okay, I will not use the pointer. All right, but anyways, you can see where I circled. It says that we're going to be affected by 94% or something. But if you read off on the left margin, would be your right margin. I'm sorry. It just says the probability that computerization will lead to job losses. Oh, okay. Will lead to job losses. That little part? Oh, yeah, there we go. You know, well, does that mean one person will lose their job? I don't know. But here's the thing to think about, because since you haven't graduated yet, you may want to make some changes in your career. You can see that, you know, being a dentist or a clergy. You know, my father, I don't know what it's like in Europe, but in America, professors typically are Monday, Wednesday professors or Tuesday, Thursday professors, right? We stack all of our classes on 2 days. So my father just thought, what an amazing job you have. You only work 2 days a week. And he said the only person who works less than that is a preacher because they only work 1 day a week. Well, you can see they're very high on that list. So, again, something to think about. Not that I'm giving any advice. I'm just saying you can think about that. All right. If you're not familiar with the Gardner hype curve or hype cycle, you can look it up. And there's very various versions of this. This is for emerging technology. But it's interesting to see how technology changes over time. You know, first, we get all excited about it. That's why it's called the hype curve. It's going to save mankind and all that kind of stuff. So when you're doing research and technology, you have to kind of know where you are in the hype curve. Something you're doing this year might not be of any interest next year. Just some quick comments. This is one of these kind of flyover slides, but just the idea that things are changing. A couple of big buzzwords on here. You know, in other words, you'll sound smart if you use these buzzwords, right? Robotic process automation, intelligent process automation, XBRL is a way of filing government reports, if you're not familiar with that. A very interesting thing is this concept of standard business reporting. Now, as far as I know, and I don't want to offend any other countries. I think the Dutch are ahead on this. I know Iceland is working on this and Finland is working on this. But it's this idea that, we're all sending these different reports to the government. Why can't we come up with one standard report that the tax people could use, the financial people could use, the licensing people could use? So it's a very interesting area to look into, standard business reporting. And the other new thing on this slide is this concept of business process reengineering. Now, that's an old concept, but the last thing you want to do in this digitization is just take your paper-based system or your semi-automated system and just switch to an automated system. You have to really rethink what the processes should be. So many years ago, Ford did this, Ford Motor Company, and they just told vendors, stop sending us invoices. Oh my God, the external auditors went nuts over this. Oh, this is a key document in our audit. Well, we don't need it. We sent the company a purchase order. They shipped us the stuff we ordered. We know we owe them money. You don't have to send us an invoice. So these are the kinds of things you start thinking about. Okay, so good old days. So, right? I mean, you guys are all way too young to remember the good old days. Sorry. But, I remember doing security analysis for companies. And we used to go and see if you could see through their windows. I mean, think about this. Like, a person could be across the street with a telescope looking at somebody's computer screen and copying down customer names and stuff. This used to be a big deal. We used to tell clients to plant trees next to their building. And we got paid for this, hundreds of dollars an hour to say plant a tree, okay? And as you know from auditing, segregation of duties is a real key component, which was a big part of the audit, always looking at that kind of stuff. And the big thing, which you guys are all way too young to remember, was we used to have this debate of whether we should audit around the computer or audit through the computer. I don't even know if you've even heard these phrases anymore. But we loved, no auditor would admit this publicly, but we all liked auditing around the computer, because basically what you did is you looked at the paper going into the computer, you created expectations of what should come out of the computer in terms of paper. So you were comparing paper in and paper out, and if they kind of matched your expectations, life was good, and the computer was just this black box that we didn't really understand. Okay. So, like I said, that's my star popped up there. Just, again, auditors didn't like to admit this, but we liked auditing around the computer. So nowadays, in this digitized world, okay, so around the computer doesn't exist anymore because there's no paper, okay? And what does segregation of duty mean when the computer is doing 5 steps in a row? In other words, these steps used to be segregated amongst different people. But now the computer is doing it all. So what does segregation of duty mean in that kind of environment? And then, of course, we have all these data leaks and stuff. It's cybersecurity. Now, I put cybersecurity in italics because nobody knows what it is. Okay? If you ask 10 people, you'll get 15 different definitions. All right? And physical perimeters mean nothing anymore. I don't know the last time somebody gave advice to a company to plant a tree in front of a window. Because now people are traveling everywhere with their iPhones or whatever technology you're using. It's got all the company data on it, access to the company. We're using airport Wi-Fi, which we shouldn't be doing, but we do, and hotel Wi-Fi. So this concept of perimeters doesn't mean anything anymore. So things are just changing. And the foundation to all of this digitization, this is old technology, is ERP, ERP systems. Hopefully I don't need to explain that. So that started moving us towards paperless inside the company by integrating everything, all right? The famous German company, SAP, at one time probably owned 85% of the market for this kind of stuff. And then, of course, along comes the internet, 1999, actually, 1999. No, 1969, I'm sorry. The internet was 1969, I'll get it right in a minute. Anyways, so the internet came, but it was commercialized in the 90s. I'll get it right here in a minute. But the point is, okay, now we can integrate between companies. So think about this thing called supply chain management, where company A's computer is sending orders to company B's computers. There is no human intervention. Somebody told the computer at A, when inventory gets down to a certain level, order more units. And it just does it. Am I making sense? You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's just all automated. How do you automate? How do you audit this? I'm not going to talk much about blockchain, if you've heard about blockchain. Oh my God, how do you audit blockchain? By the way, and if you ask 10 people, you'll get 20 ways that they think you should do it, right? I mean, nobody's agreed how do you audit blockchain, because technically, if it's a public blockchain like Bitcoin, nobody owns it. So who are you auditing? Okay? So anyways, moving on. Oh, well, actually, from an accounting perspective, that last little bullet I have there. So I was doing work for a movie studio in Los Angeles. I won't tell you who it was. I mean, it wouldn't be that important, but I probably shouldn't tell you who it was. But every employee had a purchase. Well, first they were called purchase cards, but now the card doesn't exist. It's virtual. You just have a number. But they could go to Staples. You guys know Staples, the office supply company? So you could have an account there through the company, and let's say it's me. I can order up to $10,000 worth of goods without any approval, and Staples will accept the order. But Staples has to know that I cannot buy capital goods. In other words, I can spend $10,000 to buy paper, but I can't spend $10,000 to buy computers. So what kind of control is that? Who's going to audit that control? Now, by the way, I'm not saying it's bad control, but again, whose control are we auditing when we audit the controls? And of course, now we got all the new guys on the block. We got cloud computing. So companies are sending all their work outside now, or more and more of their work. And as my example under the bullet, we have these as services. So we have software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, blockchain as a service, database as a service. And that's the service the cloud company is providing you. They'll say, yeah, stop using Oracle databases on your computer. Use Oracle databases on our computer. We'll keep them up to date. There'll always be the latest version. You don't have to worry about version control. So just put all your data on our systems. Now, where are your systems? Oh, they're in Iceland. They're in Puerto Rico. We don't know where our systems are. They're just everywhere, right? Because we're buying a cloud service from Amazon. You know, Amazon's the biggest provider of cloud services. It's a crazy world out there. All right. Now, by the way, people say these icons that I have on here, these emojis look like me. I don't know. You know, blue sport coat, blue shirt, I don't know. But anyways, now, what I want to do is take a quick flyby on big data. Probably big data and data analytics is probably the hottest area right now, at least in terms of research, because you could have the most impact, right? If you invite me back next year, I'll probably talk about blockchain. But blockchain is not quite there yet from a research perspective. By the way, some people would argue that point with me. All right. So let me just get all this up real quick. Today, when accountants talk about big data, they're typically not talking about the data side of the house. They're actually talking about the data analytics side of the house. And that's our competitive advantage. You know, we're not software engineers. We're not going to tell companies how they should structure their data. You know, we're just not going to do that. That's not our competitive advantage. But our competitive advantage is to tell them how to analyze the data. Okay. So a lot of times when you hear accountants, professional accountants, talk about big data, they're really talking about the data analytics side of that equation. And again, it's not a big deal, but just to let you know, right? And auditors are even talking about a smaller piece of that puzzle. Auditors are, you know, they talk about big data, but trust me, they're not really doing anything with big data on the data side, okay? They are starting to do more and more stuff on the analytics side. That's why I tried to make the two bubbles look a little different size. And here's another way to look at the same thing. So the client, or a company, let's just say a company, uses data. But for sure, as we say in the Valley, for sure, they're not using all the data that's available to them. And that data is called dark data. So data that companies collect and don't use is called dark data. And the point of our research, just to throw that out there, is to move companies and auditors into this world of dark data. We got all this data that's out there that nobody's using, okay? So let's think about how we could use this. I know time is ticking. I'll give you a really quick version of a quick story. There was a company in California called MiniScribe, Mini, M-I-N-I, Scribe. They had an exclusive contract to make hard drives for the original IBM PCs. Okay, so they made hard drives I mean, anybody could buy their hard drives, but for a while they had an exclusive agreement with IBM. They were the sole provider of hard drives, So they were a fast-growing company, and they wanted the company to keep growing fast because it, of course, makes the stock go up. Well, they started violating accounting rules to make their numbers look better. They had a warehouse close to IBM's warehouse, so it was still their warehouse. But every time they shipped hard drives to their own warehouse, they called that a sale. Okay, hopefully you guys remember from Accounting 101, that's not a sale yet, right? That's not revenue. But they were shipping to their own warehouse. Well, pretty soon that wasn't good enough. Now, you're not going to believe what I'm going to tell you next. They eventually put bricks in the boxes and shipped them to the warehouse. Yes, bricks, you know, good old bricks that you would build a house out of, right? So in hindsight, you could say, well, if I was the auditor of that company, I should be suspicious that they're buying a lot of bricks, right? In other words, how many auditors audit bricks? None that I know of, okay? Am I making any sense? I don't know. But the point is, we need to think outside the box. You know, hard drives have 4 non-magnetic screws that hold hold the clamshell together on a hard drive. 4 magnetic, well, they're brass screws, so they're non-magnetic. Well, if they said they sold 1 million hard drives, they should have purchased and used 4 million of these screws, right? Auditors never, well, at least in the past, they don't think that way. That's part of this big data, dark data. You know, we don't look at that stuff. All right, there's a lot of definitions of big data, but the key that a lot of people use, KPMG uses this a lot in their presentations, IBM, is this thing about the 4 V's: volume, variety, velocity, and veracity, which means quality, basically. All right, and people have added more V's to this, but if you hear people talking about big data, they frequently refer to the 4 V's, so you can you see what that is. All right. So now we get this great question for us researchers. Well, is accounting big data by itself? In other words, I'm auditing a bank, and man, they got millions and millions and millions of transactions. Is that big data? Because they got a lot of volume? Well, what about the other 3 V's, right? So when we audit a company, we audit historical data. So its velocity is 0. It's historical data, it's just sitting there. So the velocity is 0. Variety is, it's not 0, but it's just gap-based accounting, right? And veracity is also very low. So you can have this argument whether accounting is big data if it has a lot of volume, but you could say strictly it's not. That is no. The answer is no. Okay? See, here's accounting in the scheme of big data. See the little yellow square down in the rectangle down in the corner? That's accounting data in the world of big data. Now, do we care that it is or isn't? Well, I would argue we don't really care because it's a good starting point. So if you were doing research and you wanted to do data analytics and you needed a lot of data, well, use banking data. Even if it's accounting data, you're still going to learn a lot from analyzing that data. Did that make sense? It was kind of a circular argument. Yeah, accounting data is probably not big data, but it is a pretty good place to start. Okay. But look at what's on here, and this kind of gets to what Al was saying. You know, companies like Walmart have cameras pointed at their parking lot. And it's constantly monitoring the number of cars parked in the parking lot. And this is stored digitally. In other words, you can analyze this data. And they do. You know, Walmart, right? When I say Walmart, the big store, right? So they know how many cars are in the parking lot. And they can correlate this with advertising campaigns, the weather, whatever, okay, the season. And they can tell, oh, things are down for some reason. And our store in Lafayette is down. Well, okay, let's do some newspaper advertisements just for Lafayette. We need to get a little more traffic coming in. So, I mean, everything is digitized. Phone calls, email, everything's digitized. How many people visit your website? How long they stay on your website? This is all big data. Now, what about the analytics side? Well, again, the purist would say data analytics is looking for heretofore unknown relationships. You know, if you said, oh, is there a relationship between age and the kind of cars people buy? That's not really data analytics, right? We may not know the answer, but we've already defined both variables, the dependent variable, the independent variable. What we're looking for is new variables, new relationships that we didn't even know existed, okay? So auditors are looking at this more and more. There's predictive analytics, because I mean, again, auditing is based on expectations. So we can use predictive analytics to help with our predictions. What do we think the result should be? Now, auditing, we don't do much prescriptive, because that's about optimizing, but we'll leave that for the moment. Now, here's what auditors really like. See, this is what I tell my students. Here's what the auditors tell you, and this is what they tell you when you give them a few glasses of wine. It's two different stories, trust me, okay? So yeah, they like data analytics, and oh, they like big data, but what do they really do on an audit? They do data visualization, which is the child of data analytics. I don't know what analogy you want to use, but visualization, it's just barely analytics. Now, by the way, I'm not trying to discount it, because interesting things can come from it, but it's not a deep dive into the data. So here's a real quick example. It was made up by another professor. I thought it was pretty good. So if you look here, so these are five purchasing agents in a company. And only one of them seems to be buying from this company called Master Cleaning something, okay? So, gee, why is only one purchasing agent buying from that one company? Well, wait a minute. Here's another company that everybody else uses that has a very similar name. Uh-oh. Fictitious vendor. Fictitious vendor. Okay, you see? Just a quick little visualization. Something's funny here, okay? So let's look at Jose. Remember, Jose was the only one who was buying from our fake vendor. By the way, what is he buying? He's buying a lot of brooms, right? He's only buying brooms from our fake vendor, and he's buying brooms for our real vendor. What's this guy doing with all these brooms? I suggest you go to the local flea market and see what this guy is selling on Sundays at the flea market. I'm guessing a lot of brooms, okay? And then Sally, she seems to be buying a lot of trash bags. Now, maybe this company needs a lot of trash bags. But, you know, again, this is not, you know, we're not going to indict these people based on their trash bag purchases, but it's a red flag to the auditor, okay? So auditors love this. This is a Tableau. If you guys know Tableau, the software. And there's a free version. I forgot what it's called now. Anybody know? There's another visualization tool that's actually free. You can download from the internet. I apologize, I don't remember the name. In the United States, Tableau, the company they just basically give it to professors and students to use. So there's no reason to go get the free one. But anyways, they love visualization. That is the auditors. This is just a generic diagram of analyzing emails. Right? Now, you think, all right, so what you're looking for is unusual situations. Is somebody part of a group that shouldn't be part of a group? Is somebody communicating from one group to another group that seems unusual? Why is the CEO sending emails to somebody in the warehouse? Seems unusual. Okay? But if the CEO is smart, they're not going to talk directly to them. They'll use a conduit. Now, again, this is just a generic slide. I'm not saying this is an example, but see, somebody in this group is communicating through this person to that group. So those are called conduits. So this was kind of our second generation of starting to analyze emails. We didn't just look for the CEO talking to strange people, but were there conduits between the CEO or CFO and some other person? Right? Am I making sense, hopefully? Now, again, when the auditors are not drinking wine, they'll say, oh, yeah, we love big data. It's going to improve data audit quality and efficiency. Okay, although they don't like to say it improves audit quality, because then it's like, oh, that means your current audit is not The highest quality? Mm-hmm. Okay. But here's what they tell you after you give them a couple glasses of wine. Oh my God, we're so afraid of big data. All right. Now this is just a generic list. By the way, how am I doing time-wise? Oh, 5 minutes, okay. So here's a generic list of the database qualities. This is just a generic list. And this is what the auditors tell me. It's like, we would spend so much time trying to determine if this big data was usable, quality is good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're not sure if it's worth doing. In other words, we're not sure if it's really cost effective. Hopefully there's no practitioners in the room. But it's, you know, it's like, hey, it's going to take time and energy to do this, which I understand. Again, I'm not trying to be negative, but a few glasses of wine get you to the truth here. But here's the specifics to the audit profession. You know, they say that, you know, there's no GAAP, there's no IFRS for other data that's not accounting data. The PCAOB, which I know doesn't affect you guys, but this is the group that inspects auditors in the United States. They don't know what to do about big data. I mean, they'll admit this publicly. They just don't know what to do, okay? So there's no guidelines, there's no, well, there's no guidelines. Let's just leave it at that. And false positives will drive you nuts. I worked on a project, you know, we got 46,000 unusual transactions. What do you do when you have 46,000 unusual transactions in a sample? In other words, we weren't using all the data of this Fortune 500 company. We were using 1 month of data, and we found 46,000 unusual transactions. What do you do with that information? Because the PCAOB says any anomaly that you find, you have to investigate and document in your work papers. I got to document 46,000 unusual transactions? Okay. And then we got the skill issue, you know, who's going to do this, and so on and so on. Since time is a ticking. All right, now, just what I'm trying to capture in this slide, I don't know if it does this, but what I'm trying to say is this, right? We've got new data sources like big data, and we have new tools that auditors could use. In other words, it's the traditional auditors here using traditional tools, looking at traditional data. And as I've tried to capture with these triangles, is that auditors are feeling very comfortable moving into new tools. They're not very comfortable in moving into new data, okay? Now, sometimes it takes a couple glasses of wine for them to say that, but trust me. All right, so you can think about this as you're thinking about your research. They're more interested in new tools as opposed to new data right now. Okay, so I have to put my glasses on so I can read my own slides here. All right, so I'll just buzz through these really quick. All right, so what kind of data could you use? Well, nobody thinks that auditors should just go carte blanche into a company and start analyzing all that dark data. I mean, it would be silly. It would be so costly. So the kind of research we should be doing is kind of helping them. Like, well, what part of that big data, right, might be valuable? Am I making sense? You know what I'm saying? In other words, let's think of an example. We could look at how much gasoline UPS uses. You guys know UPS, the delivery company, or FedEx? We could look how much gasoline they use and then compare that to their revenue. There should be a correlation, right? So if all of a sudden they're saying their sales are going up 10% and their gasoline usage went down 3% and there's no explanation for that, that should be a red flag, right? So in other words, we can be smart. We're not going to go and look at all the big data, but what's kind of once or twice removed from accounting data that might be useful in taking us down that road? And, you know, what are the benefits, tangible, intangible? What's kind of the cost relationship? What are some of the technical issues? Now, I don't know what it's like in Europe, but in the United States, you know, when the big four are drinking, you know, a glass of wine and they start complaining to me, the thing they complain about is our students have very low business acumen. In other words, you go to a business school, but you don't have a clue how to run a business, right? Because you go into these silos. You're an accounting person, you're a finance person, you're a marketing person, but you don't really have this overall view of how to run a company. So when you're auditing a company, the company will explain to you, oh, the reason there's a disconnect between gas usage and this is because of something, and you're not smart enough to kind of say, well, wait a minute, that just doesn't sound right to me. Am I making sense? So you need technology skills, you need business acumen skills, because now that you've done the analysis, you've got to translate the analysis. Because cluster analysis, AI, machine learning, they do not explain why they got to the answer they got to. Let that sink in for a minute. This is not regression. When you're doing neural networks and machine learning, they just say, this belongs to this cluster. Well, what's that cluster? The software doesn't say, oh, this cluster means this. It just says, these things seem to cluster together here, and these things seem to cluster together there, but there are no R squares, there's no T's, whatever statistical measure you want to use, there's none of that. So if I end up with 5 clusters, I, as a human being, have to define those 5 clusters. What do those clusters mean? What's common about those people that's different than those people that's different than those? Am I making sense? I mean, it's a big deal. And you have to document this in your audit work papers. That's why it's a big deal. All right? There's way too many things to try to go over here. But again, just look at how this paradigm shift has happened in terms of segregation of duties and internal controls and computers doing more and more work, and this reliance on AI to make decisions, and so on and so on, okay? So, critical success factors. This is my last slide, so this is good. Got 1 minute left, probably. Okay, so try to balance IT and accounting research. Right now, there's kind of the guys over here doing IT and the kind of people over here doing accounting research. We got to get them to kind of work together more, okay? In other words, don't go overboard on each side. Controls can't be studied independent of IT. When you hear companies talking about their controls, or you see audit papers talking about controls, and they never mention IT, it's like, what controls are you looking at? Okay. So one of my pet complaints is if you look at the audit journal that's published by the AAA, if you were a Martian visiting Earth for some reason, and you read the journal, right, you wouldn't even know computers exist. Have you ever seen an article in the audit journal that mentions automated controls or how companies use computers? No. Trust me, no. All right? So think about those things and balance theory and practice. Part of the slide that Thorsten put up, the famous slide that he put up, that's all part of this pathway commission to try to get a better blend of practice and research. So try to think about that in your research. Try to think about how this could impact practice. Okay, we're doing a very bad job of that. Trust me, we're doing a very bad job. As researchers, we're doing a very bad job of that. And, don't underplay substantive accounting and auditing issues, regulations. I know it's different here than it is in the United States. Everybody keeps suing the auditors, so obviously that's part of their decision process. Now, my last little bullet point is something to think about. It's very, very hard to get accounting firms to be part of a research project. In fact, it's almost impossible. We're just kind of getting our nose in the tent right now in the United States because the CAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, is helping us a little bit on this. But the accounting firms are very sensitive about what they're going to tell you what they do, or letting you look at work papers and all this kind of stuff. But the Institute of Internal Auditors are much friendlier. Okay? I mean, you're all from different countries, but trust me, you've got an IIA chapter somewhere in your jurisdiction in your country. And generally, they like academics. And generally, they're pretty helpful. Because now it's a company's decision. Okay, I want to study how, I probably shouldn't say Deutsche Bank because they're kind of in trouble, but it's the only foreign company. Volkswagen. Well, I shouldn't say Volkswagen either. Is there any companies not in trouble in Europe? Anyways, pick one, and say, we'd like to come in and look at how you do controls, or we'd like to see how you're using big data. Or let us do it. This is what we did. You know, when I told you we found the 46,000 things, this was a Fortune 500 company that gave us kind of carte blanche to come in to analyze how they could use big data. And there was two parts of the deal. One is, obviously we had to give them everything we did because that was the benefit to them letting us do this. And we had to be sensitive to what we said to the outside world. By the way, we used the company's, it was 3M. I can tell you it was 3M because there are papers that we published that have their name on it. So we were at 3M, and they said, we just want to see what you say about us, and that was it. So I'm just saying, think about the II. They'd love to hear from you. All right, I'm done. You want me to say any questions?
Thanks, everybody. Thanks to the panel for doing an excellent job in identifying some very important issues for us to consider in this very important and dynamic field. We have overrun quite dramatically, but we do have time for one or two questions. If anybody does have any pressing questions to ask any of the panel members, we do have time for that. I'm just going to, could you please introduce yourself and just...
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's really interesting. My name is Marta. I'm coming from Manchester. I'm a little bit puzzled about the presentations from Professor Bhimani and Professor Glenn. So I understood that you first said, we have been substituted by artificial intelligence in the business decisions. And basically you said, business, they don't worry anymore about the reasoning of the correlations. They just, react according to the correlations. They don't worry about what are the reasons behind them. Okay, and I accept that. And then Professor Glenn said something different. Is that companies or these big four, they say, students coming out of the university, they don't have this business argument. And I wonder what is the future role of universities and accounting scholars on educating students in this field. So how can we teach students, or how can we develop the field when we have this paradox in the subject?
Well, yes, okay. Well, you're asking a very good question because, trust me, again, I can only speak for the United States, but as far as I can tell you, every accounting program is scrambling to determine how to improve the technical skills of their accounting students. I mean, the accounting firms are hammering on us, to be quite honest with you, right? I mean, if your accounting students can't even use Tableau, right? You're going to look very bad in the marketplace. Your students are going to look very bad in the marketplace. So they're pounding on us, and of course, depending on what field you guys or what road you guys want to go down, they're looking for people who can teach this stuff, right? So I mean, that's the short answer. I could give you a much longer answer, but that's the short answer. Every accounting program is kind of scrambling with how to respond to the accounting firms in terms of technology. And part of the limitations is some of the faculty like me, we have gray hair and we're like, whatever. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks.
All right.
I would just add that, I mean, it's a beautiful question, very nice question indeed. I would say that digital transformation to me really means that the accountant moves away from transaction processing much more towards developing information for decision-making purposes and much, much more. But in order to do that, you have to understand digitization and what it implies. So my sense is that in terms of accounting education, we're moving gradually towards a hybrid kind of accountant, no longer the technicalist who understands everything about accounting techniques, but sort of not much more outside that. So my sense is that there's no choice but for accountants to delve a little bit more into sort of IT-related matters along the lines of sort of digitization.
Thank you. Just a quick thing. Maybe this is give you an example of the situation that we're trying to face right now. So I'm just a postdoc right now, but I'm gonna become an assistant professor here at Bocconi. And I was in the job market with Sarah last year. So the interesting thing here is that I'm an astrophysicist. And then I moved to do a PhD in applied and computational statistics. So it doesn't match with accounting, right? It's not accounting, it's not finance, not business, nothing like that. But when I came here, Professor Miles Gitzman and a few other colleagues here told me, you know, we have some interesting problems here. We would like to run some text analytics, NLP stuff, right? You're going to see something in a minute. And then, okay, this sounds interesting. I do process a lot of data and a lot of kind of strange and unstructured data. So I think that a competitive advantage that you guys might have in the future is to try to understand, maybe not become an expert, but try to understand the complexity of the data that we have right now. The way we can collect them, the way we can analyze them, and not just trust neural networks just because they can predict everything, because they cannot. So that's just my little contributions to you, and that's it. So I'll get back to you.
Thanks very much, Francisco. I'm afraid because of the shortage of time now, we have to wrap the session up. Because otherwise we're at risk of running into the next session. So I'm sorry about that. But could you join me in thanking the panel for their excellent presentation? Thank you. And could I just offer one more plug for the Accounting Research Center? One thing I ought to have mentioned that I didn't. You'll notice the camera at the back. These sessions are being recorded. You can see the sessions available on the ARC. That goes for the next sessions as well, the audit research, the Bayesian statistics one, and then the Python one. So I'm just going to leave it there, but thank you all very much for participating today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the forum. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.